From age 12 to 30, the Western Bible goes silent. But 8,000 miles away, in the ancient highlands of Ethiopia, the 81-book canon tells a different story. Imagine mist rolling over jagged peaks at dawn, stone churches carved straight into volcanic rock, some older than the pyramids. Monks in flowing white robes move like shadows through centuries-old passageways, their voices rising in ancient gaze chants that echo off walls painted with saints whose eyes seem to follow you. This is Lalibela. This is Axum. These are the living vaults where Ethiopia has guarded texts the rest of the world forgot, or chose to leave behind. While most Christians open a 66-book King James Bible, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church preserves an 81-book canon. 81. Not a minor difference in footnotes. Entire books. Entire chapters of history that Western Christianity removed, edited, or never included during the councils that shaped the Bible we know today. The Ethiopian version doesn't just add Old Testament books like Enoch and Jubilees. It carries a fuller tradition around the life of Jesus himself, where the familiar Gospels leap from a 12-year-old boy astounding the teachers in the temple to a 30-year-old man stepping into the Jordan River for baptism. The Ethiopian Canon and its preserved oral and written traditions speak of the years in between. The years the West calls silent. The years Ethiopia calls the wisdom years. Those missing 18 years were not spent quietly in a carpenter's workshop in Nazareth. According to the ancient Ethiopian accounts preserved in the broader canon and the oral traditions of the Tewahedo Church, the young Jesus, still called by his Hebrew name Yeshua, left Judea not long after his visit to the temple. He traveled east and south, seeking the roots of wisdom that the prophets before him had touched. First came Egypt. Not the tourist Egypt of postcards, but the living mystery schools along the Nile, where priests still guarded knowledge from the time of the pharaohs. There, the texts say, he studied the movements of the stars, the hidden properties of herbs, and the sacred geometry that the builders of the pyramids had used to align their monuments with the heavens. He walked among the temples where the line between science and spirit had never been drawn. From Egypt, he pressed further south, into the kingdoms that would one day become Nubia and Ethiopia itself. In the ancient city of Axum, long before the famous obelisks stood as they do today, he is said to have sat with scholars who trace their lineage back to the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. There he deepened his understanding of the law and the prophets, but also encountered teachings about the unity of all creation and the divine spark present in every human soul. The accounts grow even more striking when they speak of his time in the East. Traveling the ancient Silk Road routes, the young Jesus reached the lands of India and beyond. In the hermitages and ashrams nestled in the foothills of the Himalayas, he engaged with masters who taught the disciplines of the mind and the breath. He learned methods of meditation that allowed one to quiet the storms of thought and touch the still center where the voice of the divine becomes unmistakable. Some traditions preserved in Ethiopia even claim he studied under teachers who spoke of a coming enlightened one, language that sounded eerily similar to the prophecies he had grown up hearing in Galilee. These were not years of idle wandering. They were years of intense preparation. He absorbed knowledge, tested it against the fire of his own inner revelation, and forged a spiritual authority that no formal rabbinical training in Judea could have given him. He returned not as a simple carpenter's son, but as a man who had walked the great spiritual currents of his age, east and west, only to distill them into something radically new. Yet the Ethiopian tradition insists this journey was never about borrowing foreign ideas. It was about fulfilling and completing the revelation already given to Israel. Jesus was not becoming something else. He was becoming fully who he was always meant to be. But the most controversial part isn't just where he went, it's what he was preparing for that the modern church omitted. According to the Ethiopian accounts, these wisdom years were not a spiritual sightseeing tour. They were a deliberate forging of power. Jesus returned to Galilee carrying something the religious authorities of his day had long forgotten: direct, unmediated knowledge of the divine presence. The texts describe how he had mastered the ability to see beyond the veil of matter. In the silence of Himalayan caves and the shadowed halls of Egyptian temples, he learned to command the subtle forces that govern healing, to still storms not through ritual, but through perfect alignment with the Creator's will. He had touched the same creative power that spoke light into existence on the first day. This is why, when he stepped back into Judea at age 30, his ministry exploded with signs and wonders that astonished even his closest followers. The Ethiopian tradition does not present these miracles as random acts of kindness. They were demonstrations of a mastery he had cultivated in secret, preparation for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of both earth and heaven. He came not only to teach love and forgiveness, but to restore a direct path to God that had been buried under layers of tradition, temple commerce, and priestly control. Every healing, every exorcism, every command given to the wind and waves was a living rebuke to the idea that access to the divine required intermediaries or animal sacrifice. The accounts go further. They suggest that during those hidden years, Jesus also received clear revelation about the true nature of his mission, a sacrificial death that would not merely atone for sin in the old legal sense, but would tear open the barrier between humanity and God once and for all. He prepared in body, mind, and spirit for the cross, not as a victim, but as a conqueror who understood exactly what his death would unleash. This level of foreknowledge and spiritual authority is largely absent from the Western Gospels. The Ethiopian Canon and its living tradition preserve a portrait of a Jesus who was never surprised by events, never merely reacting, but walking a path he had already mapped in the silence of distant lands. Knowledge this ancient is often suppressed. If you believe these texts deserve to be studied and brought back into the light, hit the like button right now and subscribe to our Chronicle of the Forgotten. Your support keeps these voices alive. When Jesus finally returned to Galilee after those 18 hidden years, the power he carried was unmistakable. The Ethiopian accounts describe the moment he stood in the synagogue at Nazareth and read from the scroll of Isaiah. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor." But in the fuller tradition, that public declaration was only the visible tip of a far deeper reality. He had already walked through fire, literal and spiritual, in distant lands. He had faced the same temptations and trials that would later confront him in the wilderness, only this time in total solitude, far from any crowd. What followed was not the ministry of a gifted teacher, but the unleashing of a spiritual force the world had not seen since the days of Moses and Elijah. The Ethiopian texts emphasize that every miracle flowed directly from the authority he had forged in silence. When he calmed the Sea of Galilee, he was not begging God for help. He was exercising the dominion he had learned to command through perfect union with the Father. When he raised Lazarus, he was demonstrating the victory over death he had already confronted and understood during his years away from Judea. These lost years explain the confidence, the clarity, and the unshakable authority that stunned the scribes and Pharisees. He spoke as one who had seen the full architecture of God's plan, not as a local rabbi repeating familiar scriptures. The Ethiopian tradition insists that Jesus did not discover his identity at the Jordan River. He had already embraced it completely, east and west, before he ever asked John to baptize him. His ministry became the public expression of everything refined in secret. The Sermon on the Mount was not new moral teaching, it was the distilled essence of universal spiritual law he had tested across cultures and confirmed through direct revelation. The parables carried layers of meaning accessible only to those who recognized the same truths he had encountered in the ashrams and mystery schools. What followed was not the ministry of a gifted teacher, but the unleashing of a spiritual force the world had not seen since the days of Moses and Elijah. The Ethiopian texts emphasize that every miracle flowed directly from the authority he had forged in silence. When he calmed the Sea of Galilee, he was not begging God for help. He was exercising the dominion he had learned to command through perfect union with the Father. When he raised Lazarus, he was demonstrating the victory over death he had already confronted and understood during his years away from Judea. These lost years explain the confidence, the clarity, and the unshakable authority that stunned the scribes and Pharisees. He spoke as one who had seen the full architecture of God's plan, not as a local rabbi repeating familiar scriptures. The Ethiopian tradition insists that Jesus did not discover his identity at the Jordan River. He had already embraced it completely, east and west, before he ever asked John to baptize him. His ministry became the public expression of everything refined in secret. The Sermon on the Mount was not new moral teaching, it was the distilled essence of universal spiritual law he had tested across cultures and confirmed through direct revelation. The parables carried layers of meaning accessible only to those who recognized the same truths he had encountered in the ashrams and mystery schools.